Oh, it's already recording. Excellent. Perfect. All right. Well, let's kick it off. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh. I have a couple people here in person with me that I'll be directly addressing. And then for anyone who's watching this recording later on, I'm originally from the US, although I actually have spent almost 100% of my debate career on the Asia circuit, where I was working for a speech and debate company in Shanghai called Learning Leaders. And so, of course, we got to debate at Learning Leaders, but I was primarily there as a debate coach. So I've worked full-time as a debate coach for about the last three and a half years or so. Really thrilled now to have just transferred over to the Iona circuit, and I'll be starting up an MSc in Gender and Sexuality at the London School of Economics this fall. So what I'm really excited to go through in this presentation, first and foremost, are just some of the really foundational skills that can make a big difference in how we can make sure that our rebuttal is having an impact in the round. We're going to talk about the differences between rebuttals and responses. We're going to focus on how we can make our rebuttals more destructive. And at the end of the presentation, we're also going to get a chance to think about how we can get better at pre-butting. And actually, the answer to that is not to pre-butt, but instead to preempt. And so even when we're an OG, we can still have effective engagement with other teams in the round, even before any of them have spoken. So we'll have a lot of fun examples throughout this seminar. I've actually included multiple examples from recent debates I've seen or been a part of. So a lot of this is going to be really relevant to even just experiences I've had recently. And then to the people in the round, Raihan and Shafin, definitely. We only have two people here, so that's feel free to jump in and kind of ask questions as you have them as we go. We can be really interactive. So first, I will share the screen, and then we will get started. Awesome. Raihan, Shafin, can you see the screen okay?
Yes, I can see the screen very clearly.
Perfect. Okay. We'll jump into presenter view then. Y'all will be no, that doesn't make sense. Cool. Okay, we'll just do it like this. Perfect. All right, so this is a rebuttals workshop. We're going to be going over what are rebuttals, why are they strategically important, how can we be strategic with our rebuttals, and we'll also talk a little bit about pre-buttal and preemption at the end. So first and foremost, what exactly is a rebuttal? So rebuttal explains why another team's claim is faulty or wrong. It's really directly challenging them on the logic or the link or the argumentation or the characterization or the framing or whatever piece of material that they brought, really directly challenging them on that. Now you might wonder, why is it that we need to prioritize rebuttals, especially given that you can technically win a round without ever having made a rebuttal? You can exclusively make constructive, and if you make really powerful constructive, judges might intuitively weigh that over the other team. Or if you make really powerful constructive and you very explicitly compare it to the other team, explain why it's more important, you can win around without ever having done rebuttal. However, this would be really unstrategic, and rebuttal is super important for a couple of different reasons. The first is that this is just the most direct way to create clash and conflict with other teams. This is one, I think, more fun in a debate versus everyone just making their speeches, sitting down, and never engaging with other people in the round. It's almost not even a debate. It's like a series of monologues that happen to be on the same topic and perhaps maybe are arguing for opposite sides. But secondly, the higher up you go in debate, the more and more directly engaged you're going to be on clashes within the round. And if you end up not being on clash, if you end up not talking about or not focusing on the same things that most of the other teams in the round are talking about, you're likely going to get left behind, either implicitly or intuitively by the judge, who just isn't going to prioritize your contributions when they don't seem to be related to anything else that the other teams are talking about, or very explicitly by the other teams, who will attempt to rebut you or frame you out by showing how you're off clash, how you're not relevant to what the rest of the debate is talking about. The second reason why rebuttal is particularly important is that it gives you a lot of, it's just particularly important in terms of being a closing team and how you enter the debate, primarily in two ways. The first is that rebuttal can be a really powerful opportunity for you to be able to overcome your opening. So if your CG and OG was going against a really strong OO and OG didn't properly respond to OO, you can bring yourself above OG by providing much better rebuttal than they did. And this is one way that you can really powerfully enter the round as a closing team. The second is that based on how debating works, as a closing team, you don't have as much time for constructive as the opening teams do. The other opening team on the opposite side of you had up to 14 minutes to make constructives. But as a closing team, you only have 7. The other 7 minutes can still be used for rebuttal and weighing and clashing, which is great, which means that the only way to make effective use of the time that you have is to make sure that you're using the fact that BP almost arbitrarily forces you to spend half of your time rebutting and clashing when you're a closing team. Therefore, you need to make sure that you're using that half of the time effectively, or else you're unlikely to be doing well as a closing team coming into the round. The last thing to keep in mind is that rebuttal is often the only way to beat teams who are at a similar or higher skill level than you. When another team makes an argument that's equally good to yours, or when another team makes an argument that is better than yours, or has more mechs, or they have more subject matter knowledge about the issue that you all are debating about, it will probably be impossible for you to beat them simply with your own constructive. You will have to tear them down and bring down their ranking in the rounds in order to be able to push your constructive above it, especially if you feel like you have a little bit less material, or you just know a little bit less, or you have less experience than them. Doesn't mean you won't win. Underdogs win in debating all the time, but it makes rebuttal especially important for being able to pull yourself up and come out on top victorious in that round. The really key thing that I want to focus on is when we're talking about rebuttals, not all rebuttals were created alike. And actually, sometimes people think they're rebutting when they're really not. And in debating, we would call this a response versus a rebuttal. So a rebuttal is a very direct counter argument to what the other team says. It has explanation. It has reasons. It might even have impacts that flow out of you having created a counter argument to the original argument that they created. It directly engages and tries to explain why the other team is wrong. A response doesn't do this. A response just kind of addresses or acknowledges what the other team says, or contradicts it without any explanation or substantiation, right? So that would look like things such as, oh, what the other team said is not true, or there's lots of other reasons for that, or that's correlation, not causation. The last two are explicitly things I've seen within the last week, judging novice debates, of one team who said that there were lots of other reasons, but didn't explain what those other reasons were, or another team who simply said it was correlation, not causation, but didn't explain why that's true, and doesn't actually take down then the reasons that the other team did give in their argument. Another example that I've seen recently in the sports debate has to do with one team kind of asserting that Manchester United was better than Chelsea, right? But how is the judge supposed to know that? Especially because we don't have evidence. We're not able to look things up online. There's very limited amount of time in the speeches. There's a very limited amount of time in the judging period that we have after the round for deliberation. A judge it's going to be almost impossible for a judge to credit you if you haven't explained why something is wrong and the other team has explained why it's right. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that when we're responding to the other team, we're actually making rebuttals and we're actually explaining why what they said was untrue or unimportant or flawed or missing a key link versus just highlighting it or versus just acknowledging it, but not actually explaining. Because here's the thing. If another team makes an argument, and it's a pretty good argument, but is missing one link, and you simply point out that they don't have a link, but then don't explain anything else, don't create a counter argument about why you think the opposite is true, or you're not creating rebuttals that are directly clashing with that, the other team might still win with that argument because there's no automatic fourths in debate. There's nothing that automatically pulls you to the bottom of the round because it's all about comparisons. And the other team had a pretty good argument, but it was missing like one thing, and you responded to them, but never rebutted them, never disproved them, or never gave explanation about why what they said is wrong. They're still going to win with that because they still did substantially more work than you did to prove their argument, or at least trying to prove their argument. And so we need to make sure that our rebuttals are destructive and that they are actually explaining why the other team is wrong. And it'll be easy to make sure that we're doing that by simply following along to some of the any one of, honestly, the debate structures that you'll see for rebuttals in the debate community. We'll be talking about one of the most basic ones today, but I also think it's one of the most flexible and is able to adjust no matter where you are in your debating career. And that is, they said, however, we say, therefore. These 4 parts each have value, and none of them should be skipped when we're going through rebuttals. Let's go step by step. The first is they said. This is where you're specifically noting or summarize which claim in the debate that you're addressing. This is particularly important, especially when you're like closing opposition, for example. You're coming into a round where there's been almost an hour of content ongoing so far. There's so many points flying around, especially if the other teams didn't do a good job of structuring their own arguments, didn't do a good job of organizing their own arguments. The judge might not even be able to fully track everything that's happening. So you need to say, judge, first, OG said this in their second argument, making it very clear which team you're engaging and what part of their argument you're engaging, right? Or if multiple teams talked about it, you can say, judge, both OG and CG relied on this claim. Now I'm going to respond to it. Makes it exactly clear how you're engaging and with what you're engaging with. The second step is however. However is where you signpost what your rebuttal will look like, or you'll explain really briefly to the judge how you'll be addressing the opponent's faults. If you're not familiar with the term signposting simply means numbering and explaining your argument with a quick little roadmap really quickly before you make it. And because rebuttal is a counter argument, we can also do that with rebuttal. So for example, judge, both OG and CG made this claim. I'd like to respond to it. I have 3 reasons why it's wrong, right? And then you go into each reason one by one after that. Organizing your responses in this way can be really powerful because it allows the judge to make sure that they're tracking each one, to write down on the page, okay, there's going to be 3. I have to make sure to track the 3 separate things, the 3 separate contributions that are going to be coming out of the team that's speaking right now. Then you move into we say. We say is where you provide all of your responses, and there should be multiple. Why? Because 1, it's likely that the other team had more than one reason why what they said was true, which means that you need to have an equal amount of reasons responding to each of the things that they said, trying to disprove why they're wrong. The second thing is that you should probably have at least as many rebuttals as they have reasons, because if all things are considered and the judge doesn't fully buy your rebuttals, but because of your rebuttals, the judge doesn't fully buy their argument either, how does it end up being compared? How does it end up playing out? If you have more reasons why they're wrong, that gives the judge an easy reason to prefer your rebuttals, even if they're not perfect, over the team's arguments, even if the team's arguments aren't perfect. The last step is therefore. Therefore is where you're explaining the impact or the significance of the rebuttal that you've made on the round. A lot of people skip this step, but this step is just as important as impacts are in an argument, because counter arguments should also have impacts. And there's 3 ways that you should talk about what the impacts of the rebuttal that you've made on the round are. The first is that if you've made a very clear counter argument, there will be impacts that should flow out of that. If the other team has made an argument that the feminist movement should prioritize advocacy for lowering the minimum wage, right? And they've given reasons for that. And you give an entire counter argument that the feminist movement should prioritize other things that allow people to have agency in the process, such as having election day be a paid day off of work, a federal holiday, things like that. And you've shown why that's mutually exclusive. If you just stop there with your rebuttal, you're depriving yourself of actually accessing the benefits of the counter argument that you've introduced into the round. So make sure to keep going. Make sure to say, judge, if we prioritize something like making election day a federal holiday, and we've shown why this is mutually exclusive, and we've shown why it's likely to work, what the impacts of that are is that we are likely to not only see far more progressive change on things like minimum wage, but we're also likely to see an enormous amount of different types of progressive change. Because now that you have so many more minorities, now that you have so many more people from lower socioeconomic classes who can access their political ability to vote when they never could before, because normally they had to work on election day and they couldn't vote, we're likely to see far more policies being supported by them that directly result in welfare systems and directly result in benefits and redistributions of wealth that bring them more money. So not only are we doing something that accesses Gov's benefits, but we're also creating a lot of their impacts with our own argument as well. And so a counter argument can be really powerful at doing this. Make sure not to deprive yourself of the own arguments that you've worked so hard to create. The second thing, make sure you articulate the impacts that your rebuttal has had on the debate. For example, if another team has only made one very large argument and you give 5 responses and you feel like you've really taken it down, what is the impact of that? What is the result of that? The result is that the other team doesn't have much standing in the round anymore. And you should point that out. Judge, Between these 5 responses, we've shown you why OG's primary argument is wrong. And given that this was the only thing they introduced in the round, we don't think that there's any way for them to come above our team. Now, let's move on to our constructive. This is called meta debating, or if you're not familiar with the word meta, it simply means talking about something about itself, right? So if you're wearing a shirt that has pictures of t-shirts on it, that's meta. If you're debating about the debate, that's meta. And so when you're meta debating, or you're talking about the meta impacts, it's how the team in the debate is now affected by the rebuttals that you've made. Lastly, weighing or framing, right? This is a way for you to also increase the prominence or also increase the significance of the rebuttal that you've made. For example, if you're CO, in the same example we were just talking about, and OG only had one big argument, and OO never took it down, but you and CO did come in and take it down, you should point that out, right? You should frame that as a far more important contribution on your bench than what OO gave. And this is a way for you to come above your opening with a rebuttal, right? Judge, OO never responded to OG's largest argument. Given how impactful that argument was, we're pretty sure that OO isn't able to come above OG on this. But because we did fully take down OG's argument with these 5 rebuttals, that brings us above both OG and OO. And so you can use your rebuttals to weigh or frame not only against other teams, but even against teams on your own bench, which is particularly helpful for closing teams who are trying to come above their opening teams. Let's go through a quick example. And this is an example I literally saw in a debate that I judged yesterday. So super, super relevant. So a full they said, however, we say therefore. Trying to move. I don't think, yeah, whatever. Okay, so I was watching a debate yesterday about abolishing prison sentences for people who commit like non-violent or medium level crimes. The most violent and the most criminal will still go to prison, but we should abolish prison sentences for everyone else. And OG says, one reason that we should abolish prisons is that more dangerous criminals get mixed in with lower level criminals and often end up harming them, you know, abusing them, bullying them, gang violence in prisons, things like that. So the response should look like, hey, pointing this out. However, they've missed 2 key ways that prisons operate, right? And so you can be creative with your signposting here. You don't have to say I have 2 responses. You can say there are 2 ways in which prisons operate that they've missed. There are 2 components of how prisons are structured that they failed to consider, right? And you can be creative with using signposting to already be showing something that the other team has missed or already be showing something that the other team has faulted on. We say 2 things. One, that more dangerous criminals are put into maximum security prisons anyways in the status quo, which means they're separated from other lower level criminals already for the safety of the lower level criminals. Almost all nations around the world do this, which means that there actually isn't a significant amount of the most violent people interacting with the least violent people. But even in mixed instances, so for example, like medium level security prisons where there is some mixing, criminals are largely disincentivized from committing violence in prison because there's going to be large consequences for it. Their sentence is probably going to be extended to a large degree, and that's something that all prisoners don't want. They're trying to get out of there. They're trying to get back to their families. But even for criminals who don't care about that, right? Maybe they have a life sentence, and so they don't care if their sentence gets extended. There are other types of punitive mechanisms that we can use as well. We can put them into isolation, which is honestly something that's horrible. And in real life, I think we probably shouldn't do it. But for the purposes of this debate, you can argue that because it's a horrible consequence to be stuck in isolation for days or weeks on end, that even more serious criminals with life sentences still aren't going to be violent, still aren't going to hurt other criminals because they're scared of being put in isolation, right? And then we get to the therefore. What this means is that not only have we shown that the largest harm from their first argument is incorrect, we've actually introduced 2 different incentives that mean that prisons are actually probably a lot safer than the government bench is pointing that out to believe, right? And then we can even highlight in this fictional debate, or it was a debate that I saw yesterday, that this was something that our opening team never responded to, and it was one of the principal underpinnings of the entire gut bench, right? So pointing out that this is a rebuttal that affects both OG and CG, since they both rely on and they both talk about this argument. And so this would be a very straightforward, they say, however, we say, therefore, response. You know, be flexible with it. You don't have to use the words they say, however, we say. Like even in the example I've shown you, you don't say, I have 2 responses. You can say there's 2 key ways that they've missed that prisons operate. Instead of saying therefore, you can say, as a result, not only have we shown, right, you let your own diction and the way that you approach language and, you know, the terms that you feel comfortable using, use those. Don't force yourself into kind of like creating this arbitrary structure with the exact words here. Instead, just focus on each part. I need to acknowledge what's been said specifically. I need to explain what I'm going to say or highlight or signpost that. I need to then make my rebuttals. And then I need to make sure that I talk about the significance of that. I need to talk about the impacts of that on the round writ large. Okay, before we move on and to talk more specifically about the different types of rebuttals we can make, do we have any questions so far about the general structure of rebuttals? Why they're important, what we can do with them, and what the structure of a very basic, standard, straightforward, effective rebuttal looks like? Cool. Okay, we'll keep going. But again, if there's any questions, please feel free to just pop it in and let me know, since we have a much more intimate setting today. Apologize for Facebook messages popping up. Perfect. Okay, so next step. Now that we know overall what the structure of our rebuttal should look like from start to finish, we now need to focus on the meatiest part, which is the we say, where you're actually making the rebuttals, where you're actually attacking the other team. Oh, we have someone joining us. Perfect. And so there are three types of rebuttals, or there are three strands of rebuttals, you could say, three categories of rebuttals: offensive, defensive, and even if or best case engagement with the other team. Offensive rebuttals are the most important, straightforward type of rebuttal you can make. This is where you're being most destructive to the other team's arguments. An offensive rebuttal, you can think of it as where you are trying to take back the point from the other team towards your side. And so if the other team argues that prisons are unsafe, you can argue, here are multiple reasons why they're likely to be safe, actually, right? And this is taking that point or taking that argument and bringing it over to your side of the debate, hopefully where it will stay by the end of the round, where the judge will credit that. Destructive rebuttals should come first in your we say highlighting, because if you run out of time, at least you'll have made the most destructive rebuttals first. The second type are defensive rebuttals, or you'll often hear these called mitigation within the debate community. And mitigation is just where you're trying to prevent the other team from kind of securing the point or fully accomplishing the argument that they've made, right? So this sounds like things like, oh, that's not that true, or that's not always true, or here are reasons why this is not true all of the time. And so mitigation is a way to prevent the team from fully accessing their point, but it's not going to fully knock down their point, because even if you show that there are some times where their argument isn't true, you failed to show why there aren't still other times where it is true, which means that the other team still gets to access certain impacts from their argument being true some of the time. And this can be really dangerous, because if they're still accessing impacts from it being true some of the times that are really powerful, they can still win on that. And I've seen many a debate where other teams made mitigatory rebuttal, but they didn't fully take down the other team's arguments, and the other team still won, because the fact that the argument was true some of the time is still a reason perhaps not to do it, right? So for example, if you prove that there's not always violence in prisons, the other team says, but there is sometimes, and we think that it's never appropriate to sacrifice someone's life to a system that might kill them when they don't deserve death to begin with. They're only in there for a minor crime, right? And therefore, that's a reason to radically restructure the system, even if it only happens some of the time, because it's such an unjust consequence and is antithetical or opposite to what the purpose of the prison system is supposed to be. So in this case, even if you're able to mitigate it somewhat, they can still win with the impacts that they still have left. So defensive rebuttals are important, mitigation is important, but it's not going to win you the debate, or it's not going to secure you back that point, that argument. It's not really a point, right? But if you think of it in like sports terms, take that point back, take that argument back, as well as an offensive or destructive rebuttal could. The last way of really engaging with the other team's arguments, and this should be the last step of the multiple responses that you have within your we say, you have within your rebuttal framework, is an even if rebuttal, or something that tries to engage with your opponent's best case. Engaging with your opponent's best case, along with a destructive rebuttal, is the most secure way to win a debate. Why? Because if you can prove that their argument is wrong, but even if their argument is right, you should still win, there's nothing for the other team to win the debate on. There's literally no way for the judge to reason that they should still come over you on this clash, right? And so having really powerful destructive rebuttals, along with some really strategic, even if or best case analysis, can make all the difference in being able to come above the other team. And I can promise you that if you start more rigorously including best case analysis and even if rebuttals into your cases, I think you're going to see a phenomenal difference in the placements in the rounds and the rankings in the rounds that you're seeing, because you're almost cutting the other team off where they're trying to go. The other team is trying to head to this very key impact. And you say, even if this impact is true, we still win because you've cut them off. It's almost like you're driving on the highway and they have nowhere else left to drive. You're already in front of them and then you get to keep going. And so what even if rebuttals look like would be, even if there is sometimes violence in prisons, we don't think that this should be prioritized over the violence that these people perpetrate on victims, right? And then you can make really clear explanation about why the violence that happens when these people are outside of prisons is so great, is so harmful. And so you've shown that there's not likely to be violence, but even if there was violence, it's not something that should win the other team the round, because you then articulated all the violence that happens to people outside of the realm of prisons. And the violence can be not explicit graphic violence as well, right? Like a rich person embezzling a pension fund and hundreds of millions of working class people losing their pensions and ending up in this horrible economic situation where they literally are food secure and housing insecure at the end of their life because they didn't save up money because they were counting on that pension, I think is a form of existential violence on your threat to life, right? So there are lots of ways you can talk about violence and use that to show why the maybe small amount of violence that we've seen in prison doesn't matter at the end of the day, because they deserve to be there perhaps, and or they're committing violence onto other people, right? So that would be an even if or best case scenario. I think another example here, if you want to use international relations, the other team says, this is so bad because this is going to worsen relations between the US and China, right? You might say, let's just put Trump aside for a sec. Trump complicates everything. You might say, okay, opponent's best claim here, if everything goes well on their side, is that the relationship between China and the US is going to get worse, right? Even if that's true, we don't think that's a bad thing. And then be creative, come up with reasons why it is that maybe this could be a good thing. You could talk about the fact that we are pretty certain that China is sneaking microchips into the manufacturing technologies that it's selling us, and that pivoting away from China, finding other manufacturing sources is probably something that's good for the national security of the US. You can talk about the ways in which having become over-reliant on Chinese debt, for example, is something that's detrimental to economic and national security. And so even if this worsens relationships between the US and China, because it's going to cause a pivot away from China, we think that's probably a good thing. Here's why, XYZ. This is a phenomenal way to just shut them down, because they were relying on this fact that, oh, bad relationship with China should win us the debate. And you can say, no, there's actually a lot of good things that would come out of that. We actually accept that, right? We bite the bullet. We fully take that on. If that happens, we're happy for that to happen, because we think there's lots of positive things that could come out of that as well. And so this is what even if or best case rebuttals look like. Let's go through an example. And so this, again, is an example that I saw at a very large tournament, Taylor's Debate Open, a couple of months ago in Malaysia. And so the motion was about whether or not we should be integrating Bollywood and South Indian film circuits together. In the status quo, they're largely separate. And so should we be actively integrating them together was the motion. And the opposition claim was, no, we shouldn't integrate them, because if we integrate them, investments, wow, some poor spelling here, investments, jobs, and opportunities are going to leave the South India circuit, leave South India shoots, leave cities, towns, regions within South India, and transfer over to Bollywood. They'll get sucked into Bollywood. And therefore, we're going to have talent leaving, brain drain. We're going to have money leaving. We're going to have less shoots in those regions, which means less economic production happening. This was a really interesting argument. But what I saw the speaker do in response was so powerful, because they destroyed this argument with one rebuttal. They still made two more, but the destructive rebuttal that they had at the front was enough to have won the round, most likely. And then the other two were just like the cherry on top. Once you're already in front of the other team, we're able to keep driving. And so the rebuttal that the speaker brought in response was, no. The opposite is true, right? If we integrate these together, far more investment is going to flow from Bollywood to the South India film circuit. Why? Because it's so much cheaper to shoot there. Food is much cheaper. Human capital is much cheaper. It doesn't make any sense that people would shoot more in Bollywood if there are now far more cheaper alternatives to bring jobs and productions there. So we think that Bollywood is actually going to invest in far more films, shoots, and productions within the South India film circuit, which actually sees integration as a better metric or a better mechanism to be able to access all the things that opposition is trying to do, trying to create jobs, trying to ensure the economic livelihood of people in that region, right? And so this right away destroys the other team's arguments in a very intuitive and compelling way, right? We know that Bollywood, and we know that these people care about money, and if they can save money by going to the South India film circuit locations and shoots, obviously they would do so, right? And the other team was never able to come back from this. The other team was never able to explain why this would never happen, which means that this first rebuttal was probably enough. But the speaker did choose to include the other components as well, right? A defensive rebuttal. But okay, some investments will probably flow to Bombay, but we think that the returns to the South India film industry that are going to be made up by increased exposure and representation. And this was what the case was for this speaker. They had made arguments about how you'll see more representation for the South India circuit are going to be a net good, right? So we don't think that this is enough to win them the round. But then they included a very powerful even if, and this even if I also think was very strategic in this round because they highlighted that, even if Op is right, and even if we see a lot of investment flowing into Bombay, even if we see a lot of film directors and talent flowing into Bombay, it's not a permanent process. And we think that they often end up going back home afterwards. Why? Because they want to give back to their community. They don't want to make it big and never come home, especially if they never succeeded at home. They want to come back and validate themselves. And the speaker used this brilliant example of what the director of Parasite did, who's a South Korean director, I'm 99% sure, ended up making an award-winning film in the US. So, left and went to Hollywood, made Snowpiercer, saw critical success, but then this director went back home and made the Korean language film Parasite, which became monstrously popular and ended up creating an enormous amount of attention and benefit for the South Korean foreign language film industry, right? And so this was a phenomenal example to show that, again, even if Op is right, it doesn't necessarily result in the harms that they're talking about because we think that other things are probably going to happen after that we care about, that we think are good, and that we'd like to highlight on our side, right? And so I think probably either the offensive rebuttal or the even if would have been enough to win on this clash in that debate specifically. Both of them together, yes. And then both of them together with the defensive rebuttal as well, absolutely. Powerhouse, knocked out of the park, really, really effective, okay? So this is kind of an example of a setup of having an offensive, a defensive, and an even if in your comparison. I really urge you to be intentional about diversifying your rebuttals when you're listening to the other team. It's so easy and it can be so tempting to just think of a bunch of mitigation reasons, right? Well, that's not always true. That's not likely to be true. That's not true all the time. There's some people who don't abide by that. It requires less analysis and it requires less thought. And so it's easier to do while you're also trying to listen to someone else speak, which I know is hard. It's, I think still hard for debaters who've been debating a long time, even later on in their careers, to be able to listen and also generate responses at the same time. It's hard to balance both. And so it's easier to focus on kind of like lower burden responses, like mitigation responses. But you see so much more success with destructive responses, and you see so much more success with even if responses. And so get yourself in the habit of being critical about what you have written on your paper. And if you realize that what you have written on your paper is just 4 types of mitigation and you don't have anything that's actually destructive, you don't have anything that purely disproves what they're saying, drop 1 or 2 of the mitigation responses and make sure that you come up with at least 1 destructive response to include in. Same goes for even if. If you find that in debates, you are never engaging with the opposition's best case scenario. You're always just saying that they're wrong, that would never happen. You're putting yourself at risk because if they do prove just 1% more that it's likelier to happen than what you've said, you're going to lose because they only have to prove it 1% more than you. That's why you do want to make sure that you're layering in even if responses or best case responses, so that even if you failed to destroy it, you've shown that there are other good things that will come from it anyways, and that's why you should still win. So what I'd like to do now is we'll do a quick exercise where we're going to be coming up with these on our own. So I'd like to have, let's see, we have 4 people. Perfect. I'm not going to do breakout rooms because it's only 4 of us, and you guys can just like DM each other on Zoom with the Zoom chat. So I'd like to ask, please. How do I pull up the participants list while I'm still on here? That's fine. Oh, I guess we only have. Stop sharing. I can't see the participants list. Oh, okay. That's what was confusing me. It looks like we lost one of our speakers. Shafin, where did your senior go? Okay. Not sure what's going on there, but we have 2 other people. We have Zamir Beck and Vanshika. Are you both here?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to ask each of you to work on this then together. So I'm sorry. We're going to do this together, but you're going to do it independently. So here's the claim. Cell phones are distracting in schools. This is the argument that the other team has made. Cell phones are distracting in schools. So I'd like each of you to spend 3 minutes, and it shouldn't take us any more than that, right? Because that's almost half of the speech in a BP round anyways. I want you to spend 3 minutes and please come up with 1 offensive rebuttal, 1 defensive mitigation rebuttal, and 1 even if or best case scenario rebuttal. And then we'll come back together and share. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely.
Cool. So the opposition bench, whatever it is, says cell phones are distracting in schools. So let's have 1 thing that destroys this, 1 thing that mitigates this, and 1 thing that tries to engage with it in the best case scenario. Even if they are distracting in schools, why should we still ban them? I'm sorry, why should we still keep them? You're defending keeping cell phones in schools. I'm gonna grab some water really quick. Cool. We'll come back together in about 60 seconds. Awesome. Let's come back together. So Zamir Beck, can you share with us the destructive response that you have prepared? So why do you think that this claim is just wrong? It doesn't make sense. It's just totally untrue.
Maybe I will be second speaker because I need one more time.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we can come back to you. Vanshika, do you have a destructive idea of like why we think this claim is just wrong?
I don't think if it's a destructive one, but I think that no, instead cell phones make resources and active learning more accessible to students in school, and even teachers can directly share videos or share content while they're teaching, and this would make learning more better. This is my, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's actually the same one that I had in my mind as well. I absolutely think this is a destructive response. Why? Because it proves the exact opposite of what the claim is saying. The claim is saying distracting in schools, kind of presumably distracting to your education experience. And so if you can show and you can explain that phones actually make education more fun, more engaging, more accessible, these are all really powerful reasons why it's the opposite that's true. It's not that it's distracting, it's actually empowering for the education experience in the classroom. So that was awesome. That was the exact same one that I had prepared. Zamir Beck, can we come back to you maybe? Do you have a defensive rebuttal prepared or something that's more along the lines of mitigation of, oh, cell phones are not always distracting or they're not distracting all the time because...
Yes, thank you. Actually, I didn't prepare it at all, but I will do my best and I will say my speech in my general knowledge. And I think this is that the school have to encourage phone by providing other students, because the students will be, no, wait, what was my position? Opposition or position? Could you please clarify?
Sorry, yeah. So it's in the chat. So I don't want you to worry about what side you're on or anything like that. Just I want you to respond to the claim. Cell phones are distracting in the classroom. Why do you think that's not always true?
Okay, thank you. So because the students will learn more in internet right now, there is a lot of resources, a lot of sources that they might not be eligible to find in library, in book, and the phone and internet is the best way to provide with knowledge in school.
Cool, awesome, thank you. So I definitely agree, and I think that this is a more of a destructive rebuttal actually, because you're arguing that especially in certain contexts, these phones are necessary and access to the internet is necessary for the education experience to happen. So I think this is more destructive. I think a very common mitigation response in this very debate about like tech in schools or tech in classrooms has to do with parental controls, right? The school can set restrictions and not allow Facebook to be accessed on the school Wi-Fi, things like that. Right? And so it's not a perfect response. Like students can still get distracted in other ways, but you're mitigating. You can a lot of it. You're saying we can have WhatsApp be blocked. We can have Facebook be blocked. You know, we can have inappropriate sites be blocked. And so you're mitigating a lot of the distractions that students might be vulnerable to. Then the last thing we might try and add on here, if we were making a full rebuttal framework for this claim, would be an even if. So in the best case scenario that, you know what, cell phones are pretty distracting. Vanshika, why do we think we should still keep them in schools?
The argument that I'm thinking is that even if they're distracting, it is more likely that children might sneak in phones even when they're probably not allowed. So that way, if we allow students to bring that amount of distraction would be lesser, because now they're allowed to do it. So this sort of rebel nature that they have, and because they're bringing cell phones, would somehow be mitigated, and there is less chances of negative use of cell phones.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think sneaking in is a really interesting way to say, like, even if it's distracting, op is not solving the problem anyways. I think another thing, if you want to create a positive out of it, and I think that this is the best way to do an even if rebuttal, is to say, no, the bad thing that you're talking about actually has positive things as well. Another thing you could also say is that, sure, cell phones are distracting, but students need to learn the discipline in order to be able to manage their time effectively against temptation from technology. They're going to be tempted by technology for the rest of their lives, in college, at work, even like in social situations when they're out with family or friends. It's a constant temptation and distraction. Students need to build and fortify their discipline now. And it's a particularly good time to do this in school because they have support of their teachers, they have support of their parents. It's a pretty low stakes environment. And so if opposition's best argument is that they're distracting, I'd say battling distraction creates good discipline, and it's a good technique and a good skill that they're going to have either way, right? And so this kind of pulls our car in front of them, stops them in their tracks, and then creates these more positive benefits from where they were planning on parking and ending the journey. And we're saying, no, there's actually way more beneficial stuff that comes out of what you're saying is a worst case scenario. And so that could be a really powerful, even if rebuttal, to be able to layer on at the end there. Nice job, everyone. Awesome. Okay. So now that we feel comfortable with like the basic structure of they say, however, we say, therefore, and within we say, we know that we can do offensive, defensive, or even if rebuttals as the three primary types of rebuttals. A couple other things I'd like to share before we end our session today. Perfect. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint again now?
Yes, it's visible.
Perfect. There we go. What I just had already prepared, which we already talked about. Great. So there's a couple other things to keep in mind. First of all, what should I target with my rebuttal? Because we know that there's lots of different parts of an argument, right? Keep in mind that there's 4 different parts of an argument that you can target, right? Don't think of the argument as this whole thing. There's actually lots of different pieces. And if you notice that one of the pieces looks weaker than one of the other ones, you can definitely target that. The first is that you can attack the claim that the argument is making. What I mean by this is you can attack the baseline assumption that the argument has. And then when they try and explain why everything else is true, you're saying none of that even matters because the original thing that you're assuming isn't true, right? So one example would be if the argument that the other team was making went something along the lines of like, teachers who gave up better pay to go to these schools are now going to be increasingly frustrated. This is a pretty big assumption that teachers, quote unquote, gave up better pay. It's assuming that other schools had significantly better pay. And like, at least as far as I'm familiar with, whether we're talking about the US context or the China context, which is what I'm most familiar with, the majority of like public schools just don't pay well in general. And there's not a lot of variation there. And so it's not like they gave up that much better pay. But then also it's assuming that when you say gave up better pay, that the teachers really wanted better pay. And most teachers, again, that I know, don't enter the industry of teaching because they want high pay, because it's a notoriously underpaid industry. And so it doesn't matter what the rest of the arguments are about how they're going to become increasingly frustrated, because you just agree with the baseline premise that teachers like gave up better pay, could have gotten better pay, or wanted that pay to begin with, right? And that's the first thing that you can target with your rebuttal framework. The second thing is that you can target the reasons themselves. Fine. You think that maybe they did give up better pay. You don't think they're going to become frustrated because, and then you respond to the X, Y, Z reasons that the other team gave. So in this case, the other team gave 3 reasons, X, Y, and Z. You're going to be responding to each one of the reasons about why you don't think that's true, or you're going to prioritize 1 or 2 of the reasons that you think you can really effectively take down, etc. The third thing that you could do is attack their examples, right? So the other team says, we think there's a huge problem with like retention rate and teachers protesting and not sticking around. Just look for Teach for America. Teach for America sends teachers to underserved schools, and their average retention rate is only 2 years, right? That's horrible. We want teachers sticking around for a longer period of time. You can engage with this, right? You can say that that example doesn't make sense. The type of people who sign up for Teach for America are not people who want to be career teachers. They're using teaching as a professional stepping stone. And so they were always planning on leaving after a couple of years. And so this doesn't prove your point. You do want to be careful with rebutting examples because they can always just come up with another example, right? So if they have a really terrible example, definitely engage with it. But otherwise, it is a little bit more strategic use of your time to focus on the claims, the reasons, or the impacts that they gave you. Lastly, with the impacts, right? So they're arguing, their case on this ends with this idea that underpaid teachers who grow resentful and frustrated end up protesting and damaging the school community, right? You can say, this is not a bad thing. We don't think that teachers protesting damages the school community. We actually think that largely parents and students support the fact that the teachers should probably get more money. And if anything, it like coalitions and galvanizes and brings the community closer together. A lot of the time at better pay for teacher protests, teachers and parents will go, students and parents will go to these because they care about the teachers and they want to support them, and it raises more awareness. And also teachers protesting is just them using the political right that they have to engage with political protest, right? That like none of these things are bad, and therefore is not a reason to engage with, we don't even know what the policy was, right? I just used a random example. So whatever policy was, if they're using the fact that teachers will protest as a reason to do it, you can, because it's so bad, you can say, no, we actually think that teachers protesting can often create a lot of positive things. It's not necessarily a reason not to do it, especially if teachers protesting creates better benefits in a different way. The next thing to keep in mind is like, okay, so there's lots of different parts to an argument. If each argument has multiple parts, right? If they have 3 reasons within their reasoning and they have 4 impacts under their impacts, how do I know what to prioritize in the round? How do I know what to rebut and what not? Because you can't rebut everything. You only have 7 minutes. And so you really do have to make sure that you're focusing on the most important things and making most efficient use of your time. So a couple things to keep in mind. The first is try and think about it from the perspective of a judge. And this is why it can be really helpful for novice debaters to do a little bit more judging at the beginning of their careers before they switch over into speaking, if they want to switch over into speaking. Because understanding what judges are looking for, understanding what judges are likely to prioritize, understanding what judges are likely to value allows you to understand how you can best target your rebuttals, because you'll know from experience that judges are probably not going to credit this argument as much because they didn't really reach the threshold that we need to credit it. But this argument, they definitely did. And my experience tells me that the judge is definitely going to count this. I need to make sure that we take this down. The second thing to keep in mind is that if something is directly clashing with you, you have to beat the other team on that clash. So if you said that this is good for minorities, the other team says that this is bad for minorities, you really need to engage with the other team's analysis on why it's bad for minorities, or else your analysis about why it's good for minorities has been significantly undercut. The third thing to keep in mind is that you can rebut arguments that don't directly clash with you. Just consider, 1, if you have time to do that, but also 2, how important they are in the round. Because maybe the other team doesn't engage on the minority clash, but maybe that's because the other teams decided to talk about just children in general as a much more vulnerable stakeholder. And they say that that should win them the debate. You probably want to engage with them on that, even though they didn't engage with you, because they've explained something that perhaps might be considered by the judge to be more important than what you've brought in. Another thing that's helpful to prioritize when rebutting is you want to make sure that you rebut framing that the other team does. What do I mean by that? Framing is when the other team comes in and says, hey, we think that the other team has misunderstood what the status quo looks like, or we think that the other team has misunderstood how churches operate, or how religious communities function, or what incentivizes teachers to teach, right? And when they give this framing, they give this characterization at the top of their speech that tries to change the status quo or change the debate's understanding of the status quo in a way that makes your argument seem not that relevant anymore. That's really dangerous, because a change in framing can actually simultaneously make all of your arguments less relevant if you're unlucky, right? And if they're really good at framing. And so you really need to make sure that you target this framing and explain why, how they've tried to shift the understanding in the debate, or how they try to shift our context or our landscape in this debate isn't as powerful, doesn't make sense, or just is untrue. Especially if that characterization that they've introduced, that framing at the beginning of their speech, is something that makes all of your arguments look bad, right? You really want to make sure to engage with that. And then the last thing is anything that the other team directly rebuts your side on, you have to respond to. So this is especially important for second speakers. When another team has rebutted your first speaker, you have to engage with that, or else the judge has to consider the rebuttal to be true most of the time. Because the judge has to rely on what teams say in the round. The judge is not supposed to be inserting themselves, not supposed to use their own knowledge to evaluate or to adjudicate what's true or false. If the other team says that your argument is false and gives 3 pretty good reasons, the judge is going to believe that unless you take down those reasons. And so it's particularly important to prioritize rebuttal that directly attacked your team's arguments almost above anything else. The next question is then, when do I rebut? Because you have 7 minutes in a speech. Do I do it at the beginning, the middle, the end? How do I layer that in? There are pretty much 3 schools of thought when it comes to this. The first is that, and this is really common, a lot of people just put rebuttal at the beginning of the speech. You'll hear it time and time again. First, extraneous rebuttal, then my constructive. This is a helpful organizational technique. It makes sure that you don't forget any of the rebuttals that you want to make because you just get them all out at the beginning, and then you get to focus on your constructives, right? It's like divide and conquer. It's pretty clear, it's pretty clean, it's very common. The risk here, though, is that sometimes judges, especially judges who have less experience, won't credit your rebuttals as a significant contribution to the round. This is wrong, by the way. By the rules of BP debating, a rebuttal counts as a contribution for your team into the round and into adjudication of the round. What this means is you could hypothetically win with 7 minutes of rebuttal, right? That's not strategic. Why? Because it's much faster and direct to increase your team's relevance in the round by having constructive. It's also dangerous because you're never sure if the judge fully buys your rebuttal or not. So if you just do 7 minutes of rebuttal, but you don't fully take down the other team's argument, they're going to win because you have no constructive arguments of your own to really compare against that, right? So it's important to have both. But sometimes judges will say, you had too much rebuttal at the beginning of the round, and then your arguments themselves were a bit smaller, which isn't the accurate perspective, right? By the rules of BP debating, if your rebuttals were significant, if they were true, if they were powerful, if they took down whole other teams, that's a reason for you to rank above them. So even though that's what the rules say, we know that sometimes judges don't always follow this. We know that sometimes judges deprioritize rebuttal a little bit. Maybe they do this consciously because they're not a good judge. Maybe they do this subconsciously because nice, pretty arguments just look really great and they have all these really clear impacts, and sometimes rebuttals aren't quite as clear. It's not as easy to compare them against other things. And even good judges do this sometimes. And so a personal recommendation that I have that I think will really change or really lower the risk of your rebuttals not being considered in a round is to frame it as a constructive contribution or to frame it as a positive contribution. What does this mean? Instead of saying, Judge, I have 3 extraneous rebuttals I'd like to make, then I'll make my constructive. You're literally telling the judge that the second part of your arguments are constructive and the first part are not. Even though it's not true, and rebuttals can construct a reason for the judge to vote for you, you're basically telling the judge not to prioritize that. So I really don't like using the words extraneous rebuttal, or I'll start with my rebuttal, or first rebuttal, then constructives, because it almost is devaluing the importance of your own rebuttals, right? So I think, especially if you have a lot of rebuttals to make and you're worried that your constructives are going to look smaller in comparison, don't call it a rebuttal. Call it a clash. Call it a positive contribution of engagement, right? Don't use the word rebuttal, or don't use the phrase like just rebuttal, or first I'll do my rebuttals, right? What does this look like? So if the other team made an argument, and it's a really important argument, you have 4 rebuttals you want to make to it. Instead of saying, Judge, I have 4 rebuttals to this, you should say, Judge, the first contribution I'd like to make to this round is I want to clash with opening opposition on this idea of minorities, right? I'm going to win this clash, and I'm going to win it better than OG did with 4 contributions, right? First, I think what they've missed is this, and then talk about it. Second, what I think is this, talk about it, right? And so frame it to the judge like you're engaging into a clash, which you probably are, especially if that's a really important argument in the round. It probably is already a clash, or it's going to become a clash about minorities, right? And then the judge is writing this down on the paper as constructive, positive, relevant contributions you're making to the round, and all things that should be considered when the judge is trying to look at who's going to win, who's not going to. Do all debaters do this? No. There are lots of high-level elite debaters that will do 2 points of extraneous rebuttal before I move into my constructives, and it works for them. But I had found in my own personal experiences, because I like to make a lot of rebuttals, that my rebuttals were not being credited as significantly as my constructives were, even though the rules say they should be, right? And I found through simply renaming my rebuttals, judges believe them a lot more, judges credit them a lot more, and it does a lot more to push my team forward in the round. So that's just a personal suggestion that I have, is that if you want to put the rebuttals at the beginning of your speech, that's fine. Just don't call them a bunch of extraneous rebuttals. Call them a clash. Call them a positive contribution. Call them a better type of engagement than your opening did, right? Give a positive description of them and don't use the word extraneous rebuttals. The second way that you can do rebuttals is to have it be integrated throughout, right? What this means is that within your arguments, you'll stop at certain moments and say, now, the other team said this. I'd like to respond to this. Or now, the other team said that this was impossible, right? But I've just shown you how it is possible through these three ways. And so it's layering in your responses into your constructives, right? So you might have a constructive with 4 reasons, and you'll go through first reason, second reason. And the other team said this. You'll have 1 or 2 rebuttals in there, and then you'll go through your third reason, your fourth reason. This can be a really powerful structure. Why? Because it can often look really sophisticated, right? And this is something that you do see a lot of more experienced debaters do, right? Judge, all my rebuttal will be integrated, and then they move directly into it. And they somehow manage to show with each of their arguments, not only how their argument has relevance in of itself, but how it also simultaneously beats, clashes, or rebuts one of the other team's arguments. This is something I think is harder for debaters to do at the beginning of their careers because they just have less of an understanding of how all the various things flying around and around are going to play out and be able to keep track of them all. But once you start to get a little bit more experience, give it a try. See if you can make integrated rebuttals without, importantly, forgetting or dropping things. And that's the biggest risk to integrated rebuttal, is that you get focused on your own constructives and you don't explain all the rebuttals, or you don't explain them as well as you wanted to, or you drop certain things. And so that's something to keep in mind. The last thing is some people put rebuttals at the end of their speech. I would say this is the least common. I've seen this the least out of the other 2 strategies. I think mostly because people end up forgetting their rebuttals, or they run out of time because they spend too much time in the constructive, and then they're not able to make any of the rebuttals that they wanted to make. So it can be risky. It is ultimately, though, up to personal choice. And I will say that it varies on the debate. Sometimes I put my rebuttals at the beginning of the speech. And this is when I'd like to make an extension that is significantly different than what the opening house has talked about, for example. It doesn't make sense to integrate it because my rebuttals to them and my positive arguments for myself are going in very different directions. So I like to divide it, right? So I'll put my rebuttal at the front, but I'll call it a different clash, right? Sometimes my arguments, all of them, directly clash with the other team. When that happens, I usually opt into doing integrated rebuttal. And as I explain my arguments, I also explain how they're beating the other team and how they rebut the other team. So don't feel like you have to commit to one style, experiment, try out different ones, but also be willing to change it based on how the debate's progressing, right? And I myself have no idea how I'm going to structure my rebuttals until I start to listen to the other team. And then I understand how their arguments engage with mine, and does it make more sense for me to put my rebuttals at the front, or does it make more sense for me to integrate my rebuttals? Very last thing I'd like to talk about in this workshop, and this is something that I think is super important, and I think this is something that a lot of novices make a mistake on, is pre-rebutting. Why? And what are we talking about here? Not all positions get to rebut, especially OG gets to rebut the least amount of time. And so a lot of people think, how am I supposed to engage with the other team, especially if they don't take my POI and I can't make rebuttals? And so they'll try and make pre-rebuttals where they'll say, I think the other team will say this, and then they try and rebut it right there. Don't do this. Why? Because when you pre-rebut, you often are making a pre-rebuttal based on a certain reason that the other team is going to use, right? We think that they're likely to say that teachers are incentivized by this thing, but we don't think that's true. What's dangerous about it is that the other team doesn't even have to engage. The other team just has to come up with a different reason, right? They can stand up and say, OG thought we were going to say this. We think teachers are motivated by a different reason, and that's why it's bad. And then you haven't done anything. You've actually just wasted your time, right? And so focusing on rebutting reasons that you think the other team is going to say is more risky than preempting their impacts. And that's what I would encourage you to do, especially from OG. Preempting their impacts means that your arguments, you've intentionally made sure that they're going to prove the exact opposite impacts of what the other team is going to say. So the other team is going to say, this makes teachers happier. You make sure your arguments are showing this makes teachers far more upset. If the other team shows this increases economic productivity, you make sure that your arguments are showing that this decreases economic productivity. It's essentially very directly engaging with what you think the important clashes of the debate are going to be, right? This might sound strange, like, oh, shouldn't I be engaging with the clashes anyways? And the answer is absolutely yes, especially from OG. You should sit there and with your partner, make sure you come up with what we think the 2 or 3 main clashes or main issue in this debate is going to be. What do we think teams are going to be disagreeing about the most? But teams don't always prove opposite impacts. Sometimes they'll go in different directions. But if you're very confident that the other team is going to work towards a certain impact, you can preempt that by simply proving the opposite. What does this look like? For example, if you're having the debate, this house prefers communism to capitalism, and you're OG, and you're like, okay, I really want to make sure that we're engaging with the other teams, even though I don't know what they're going to say. I think that one of the big clashes in this debate is how this affects marginalized individuals, right? Who helps those at the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder the most? I think that they're probably going to say that because of provision of goods and services that there isn't majority demand for, it results in being a better situation for minorities. We don't want to rebut the provision of goods and services argument, because that may or may not be the reason that they end up using, right? But we do think that regardless of what reason they end up using, they're going to try and prove that this is better for minorities. As such, you can make sure that you're just proving the opposite impact. And your argument can directly clash with what this impact is by saying capitalism is worse for minorities because they often end up discriminated against, exploited without political agency, and they end up suffering disproportionately from economic inequality, right? So then, no matter what reason the other team uses, they might use the provisions of goods and services one, they might use a different one. Doesn't matter, because if they prove with whatever reason they use that it's worse for minorities, you have already shown that it's better for minorities, which means that they have to do two things. You've increased the burden that they have in the debate. They not only have to prove their argument just as well as you've already proved yours, they also have to rebut and weigh against your argument. Why is this so valuable? Because you're making them do far more work than you had to do, which means that you have won time for yourself, or rather, you have taken away time for the other team. Because if it only took you a minute and a half to make that argument, but it takes them 2.5 minutes or 3 minutes to make the argument, make it as well as you did, and then respond and like weigh against it, you have way more time to do other things than what they do, right? And so that's why it's important, or it can be really helpful to preempt from OG on things that you don't expect to win, right? Maybe you think, you know what, they're probably going to win this clash because usually, like, this is the main argument for the opposition team. Any good opposition team will probably be able to win this. It's very intuitive why it's better on their side. This is not the place where I'm going to win the debate, right? You can still win time by contributing a minute of analysis on preempting that and then forcing them to do 3 minutes to take it down. And that can create an advantage for you, right? For example, in a debate about whether or not governments should bail out banks after a bank collapse or if they should do something else, usually people don't defend that banks are a good actor, right? We all pretty much know that the financial sector is full of carnivorous, cannibalistic vultures and parasites who are horrible and make selfish decisions. And, you know, look at the 2008 financial crash, look at lying and inflation increase and collusion and like predatory subprime loan mortgages, right? There's a variety of different reasons here. Most people don't try and defend that. But if you include in your argument, right, not only do we think it would be worse for governments to take over the banks, we think that the banks are better than the government in these regards, right? And you give 3 reasons. You're probably not going to win that. It's probably pretty easy for the opposition team to explain why banks make bad decisions, why financial leadership are selfish and profit motivated. But it's probably going to take them a lot more time to do that than it did you to make your arguments. And so you have more time to do other things. But then here's the thing. Sometimes you do win on these things because sometimes the other team wasn't expecting you to defend the opposite of what they were planning on saying, right? Because it's not as intuitive. And then sometimes you do win on things that no one expected you to win on. And then it results in an overwhelming win. I have seen a team win on this exact motion where no one expected them to be defending banks that severely, right? Everyone expected them to just be critiquing the government a lot. And they both critiqued the government, but they also gave some good reasons why banks are just better at managing themselves post-bailout than the government, even though they can be selfish. And they overwhelmingly won because they proved both that the government is bad, but also banks are good, right? And so preemption, just proving the opposite of the opposite impact of what you can predict the other team is going to prove on that clash, can not only win you time, but sometimes it can just overwhelmingly win you the debate, right? And this is so powerful to be able to do from OG because you don't know what reasons they're going to use. You don't know what links they're going to use. You don't know what impacts they're going to use specifically, but you can be pretty confident of, examples that they'll use, but you can be pretty confident of the impacts that they'll try to reach on the major clashes. Because as long as you can identify the major clashes, you know what impacts they're going to target, right? And then proving the opposite of those impacts, proving X is Y or proving black is white, you might be able to think of it, can allow you to win. They're going to say banks are bad at this. We can clash them on this by saying why banks are good at this. They're going to say minorities are going to be harmed by this. We'll make sure we're directly clashing on this, even though we don't know how they're going to explain it, by giving our own reasons why it helps minorities, right? This really helps you stay on class from OG. Make sure that you don't get outframed by the other teams who all say, oh, OG talked about this random thing, because you talked about the thing that they wanted to talk about. And so they are forced to clash with you on it. It forces the room to keep you relevant in the round. And this is the best way to be able to win. If CO is still talking about the OG case near the end of the debate, it's a good indication that OG did very well in the round because no one was able to take them down. They were very on clash. They were very relevant. And even though they couldn't make explicit rebuttals, their material implicitly or indirectly was still engaging with the other teams. Okay. We're going to do another final little practice on this last idea of preemption, right? Okay. So same motion. This house prefers communism to capitalism. You all are going to pretend that you're OG, okay? And you all are going to, you should know, just because communism and capitalism being different economic systems approaches, that of course, one of the major clashes in the debate is going to be where we see healthier and more vibrant economic growth and economic systems, right? Big clash. We know that opposition is going to try and prove that capitalism is good for economic growth. That means that we can preempt them effectively on this clash by making sure we include some analysis about why capitalism is actually bad for economic growth, or why capitalism stimulating economic growth is bad, right? And so I'd like everyone to please spend 3 minutes silently and independently thinking, how can we preempt this argument, right? Assuming that there's going to be an economic growth clash, and assuming the opposition team is probably going to try and argue that capitalism is good for economic growth. How can we preempt this? What is an argument we can make instead, in our case, that shows why capitalism is bad for economic growth, or why capitalism stimulating economic growth is not a good thing? Awesome. Let's come back together. So let's start with you, Vanshika. What do we think is a way that we could try, and there's lots of ways, right? What's one way that perhaps in our analysis on economic growth, we could try and preempt this if we know the impact that OP is going to try and prove?
So the OP is going to prove, or might try to prove, that there is greater economic growth and there is fast economic growth because of capitalism. But we can counter that by saying that if we think that we can achieve growth faster by capitalism, the problem with that is because of this fast growth, there is also a chance of mass employment, and drastic sort of recession, which many countries are not already prepared to deal with, and also considering the vast social inequality that comes with capitalism in itself because of wage differences that already exist in the society. It's even harder to cope with the recession that comes with capitalism. So even communism provides economic growth at a slower rate, but at a much, even if it is conservative in terms of growth, it is better, and it does greater good to the society because it's consistent.
Nice job. I think that's 100% true. And I think that'd be a phenomenal thing to include from OG on this perspective, because you're biting the bullet right away. We're like, we accept communism probably has slower rate of growth, right? Why is that good? It's steadier, it's more stable. It doesn't come with capitalism's booms and busts that cause these horrible recessions that have very real material impacts on people in society's lives who don't have the material capacity to be able to overcome those recessions. Really nice. Love that. Zamir Bek, what about you? What's your idea? So if we know that the opposition team is going to try and prove that capitalism causes fast, strong economic growth, well, how can we try and preempt this from OG? Zamir Bek, are you there? Oh, no worries. Shafin, are you there? Do you have an idea for preemption on this? I know your mic isn't working, but you can type it. Oh, okay. We also lost Shafin. Okay. All right. Looks like everyone's having internet issues, but that's fine. So really nice job, Vanshika. I think that's one way to absolutely do it. I think another idea, or perhaps you could even do both, is that not only is fast economic growth more volatile in terms of booms, busts, recessions, and depressions, being things that we can perhaps avoid with smaller and steadier growth coming from communism. Another way you could preempt this impact is that fast economic growth is also not good, because fast economic growth is more damaging to the environment. To the extent in which the growth is extraordinarily fast, we're not able to regulate companies, we're not able to regulate corporations. When we're prioritizing this growth, we're often doing so at the expense of environmental protections and regulations on like factories and waste disposal and whatnot. So we can also argue that we would prefer a system that prioritizes slower growth, because that gives us more time to regulate, that gives us more time to arbitrate, that gives us more time to protect and buffer the environment against the expansion of the human species, against the expansion of urbanization and industrialization and modernization. I think is another potentially interesting way you kind of preempt this, because then no matter how much time they spend trying to prove fast economic growth, you've already shown why fast economic growth can be really risky for the environment, which can cause an existential global crisis in the form of climate change, global warming. Awesome. Thanks everybody so much. So that's just about the end of our presentation today. I know we've already gone on for quite a while, covering both rebuttals, but then also prebuttals and preemptions. Does anyone have any burning questions they want to ask me before we wrap it up today?
I just have a question in terms of how much do we sort of weigh rebuttals. For example, in a closing opposition's case, their whole case comprises majorly of rebuttals, all right, that sort of tackle closing government and opening government. So how much do we credit them for not adding constructives in the closing half and just giving rebuttals that sort of deconstruct the cases of both the government bench?
That's a great question. I do think it's an unlikely scenario for you to ever be in, because I think that it's very rare that like a team will only rebut for 7 minutes, but I think it's an interesting kind of like theoretical exercise. And I also think it's an exercise that a lot of judges would get wrong. The first thing to consider is simply how well do they rebut opening government and closing government? Because if they mitigated their cases to a significant degree, but opening government and closing government still have some, even if marginal benefits, they should still come over CO. because CO didn't prove, or just kind of from this thought exercise, didn't prove any benefits of their own. And so they're predicating success on being able to negate or fully disprove what's coming out of GovBench. So if they did not fully disprove them, GovBench should probably still come over them. But let's assume it was beautiful, brilliant rebuttals, like 14 minutes rebuttal between the member and the whip, right? And they fully destroyed both opening government and closing government, right? I think in that situation, it's likely that they would come over opening government and closing government, especially if closing government was not able to respond with rebuttals to those rebuttals, because opening government and closing government therefore have no strong material left to be able to stand on in the debate, right? I think it depends a little bit on how the whip engages with this. It does depend a little bit on how the whip frames and weighs the rebuttals that we've brought, and how the whip, as we also talked about at the beginning of the presentation, impacts out the rebuttal. There is a huge difference in terms of the certainty that a judge can prioritize this rebuttal if you simply make a destructive rebuttal, versus if you make a destructive rebuttal and then you or your partner make sure to impact that out, explain what exactly that does to the team's case, explain why exactly that must then deprioritize the team's ranking in the round, and do the meta debating for the judge versus allowing the judge to have to weigh it out and do the meta debating themselves. I think then the last thing to consider is how they compare to their opening, right? Especially if OO did have some powerful constructive here. And in this case, it is, if CO doesn't do any weighing, it's up to the judge to decide, right? I think that most judges would probably prioritize the constructive. I don't think that's necessarily always true, right? Because a rebuttal should be considered as a constructive contribution to the round, and your rebuttal could be really meaningful and overcome a constructive. Constructives are just easier and they're more streamlined to digest. So if judges are tired, if they're lazy, if they're rushed, they're going to pick that anyways. And so you do want to set yourself up for success by making sure that the judge feels like you have some pure constructives in your case. But a CO could come over their OO if their whip does a really good job weighing out why these rebuttals were so significant, and specifically comparing that to the contributions we got from OO, right? And they can give us really clear reasons how OO's contribution allowed us to understand that sometimes there are good benefits. Our rebuttals showed to you why opposition bench never achieves their benefits. And given that we proved a contribution to the round that was more certain in terms of the no access that government now has to their benefits versus the occasional access that perhaps OO proved to their benefits, this is something you should prioritize in the round, because our contribution is more consistently applied to Gov's comparative, right? That, for example, would be one way that you could weigh your rebuttal against the opening's constructive. And then if CO did do that really type of powerful weighing from the whip, I think they easily could come over their opening as well. It really does depend on how, one, in short, how destructive the rebuttal actually is, and two, if the rebuttal is weighed at all against the other teams in the round. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks a lot, Joshua.
Yeah, absolutely. Does do you or does anyone else have any other questions before we close?
I had a question. If I'm in the closing bench, so how do I rebut the characterization provided from the opening half? Because in a lot of cases there you see that the opening half did a very good characterization, but you don't really have such a good extension, so you might want to go with the characterization part or recharacterize it. But how can you just rebut it or just wash out their characterization?
Do you mean for the opening team on the same side as you, or do you mean for the opening team on the opposite side as you? Whose characterization?
If I'm in closing government and the opening government gave a really good and well explained characterization, so how do you just go about recharacterizing it if you're from the closing gov?
So you basically have two choices here, right? You can either do a vertical extension where you are working within the same space that opening government has set up and characterized, and you're trying to find something meaningful that they've missed, right? For example, this happened in the debate I saw yesterday. One of the teams gave a beautiful characterization about the war on drugs and the criminalization of Black and brown bodies in the US and the mass incarceration crisis. However, they missed the components of the war on drugs where the government did things to put innocent people in jail. They never talked about stop and frisk where people had drugs planted on them. They never talked about President Nixon flooding communities of color with crack cocaine through the CIA and then creating a crisis where there wasn't one before, right? These are really significant because this is what shows us that a lot of the people in jail are innocent, right? Whereas the analysis of the characterization that we got in the debate only showed that the government really cracked down and really over-policed these communities, but never explained why the communities weren't actually committing crimes or weren't actually committing that bad crimes in the first place, right? So you can listen to powerful characterization. You can try and find if there's something that they've missed. That's what I would step in with if I were in that round. I'd be like, Judge, OG did a great job explaining to you why the government cracked down on these communities. But what OG forgot to explain was how it was that these communities were actually innocent in the first place. Because if we buy OG's characterization, yeah, the government cracked down, but I'm not so sure if that was a good or a bad thing. Because if these communities were doing really bad things, obviously the government should crack down. So what we're going to be introducing here is we're going to complete that characterization, but we're going to do the most important part, which is how it was that the government created a false crisis, incarcerated a bunch of innocent people, why that's so bad, right? So one option is to try and find out something that's missing from your opening team's characterization. The second option is you have to try and go in a different direction, right? Maybe they gave beautiful analysis on the war on drugs and mass incarceration crisis. You have to find a little bit of a different direction to go, something else to talk about, right? And then therefore, that's how you should start off the member of government speech at the top by a new framing, right? Judge, we think that the opening house has talked a lot about the war on drugs. However, in recent years, we have seen an enormous global movement for the legalization of drugs. This is particularly present in the US, which was the epicenter of the war on drugs. We have almost 20% of states now having, pivoted away from federal law and created state law that does legalize marijuana, that does legalize other types of drugs. Even the country's capital, Washington, D.C., has decriminalized marijuana. And so we think that this shifting change in public and legal culture around the criminalization of drugs means that the war on drugs is probably a less and less relevant framing for this debate. And instead, we should be focused on police brutality, right? And what are the ways in which protesters, police unions, blah, 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 kind of like shifting to a different part of the criminal justice system and how that relates to prison, right? And so that you introduce a new characterization. You're not saying that the opening one is wrong, but you're just saying maybe it's a little bit less relevant than yours, or maybe yours is a little bit more recent, or maybe theirs was missing some things and you're going to be able to fill it in, right? Those are kind of some of the different strategies that you have in terms of how like an opening sets up the debate and then how you can enter into it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. And I have another question, if you don't mind.
Sure, go for it.
Regarding the pre-battle, you're saying that you should just not say the word pre-battling, rather than you should show that if I take the case from the opposition or from the opposition perspective, then what will be the impact? So if I can prove the impact, that will do the pre-battling itself, right?
Yes, and I'll give you. I want this to be really, really digestible. So let's go through another example on this really quick. When I say pre-buttal, most people pre-buttal by trying to pre-buttal a reason that the other team is going to make, but they can always choose a different reason. But if you preempt the impact, they're going to have to end up there no matter what. For example, Raihan, if you were trying to prove that cell phones are really expensive, right? And I was trying to pre-butt you. I'm OG. I think Raihan's going to come up here and talk about why cell phones are so expensive. I think they're probably going to say that cell phones have lots of accessories that you need. But you know what? That's less and less true. A lot of accessories now are utile. You can use like the same charging code for multiple different devices. You know, we have like streamlined like HSB or like HDMI cords that like work on multiple devices. And so we don't think that they're that expensive because we think that different like cords and extra things that you have to use for your devices are not that expensive anymore. Now, Raihan, what is a different reason that you could easily make about why phones are still really expensive?
I think I need to think about it a little bit.
No, really quick. Who does Apple set the prices of phones?
I didn't really get you.
Does Apple get to pick the prices that they sell their phones at?
I think it does really make sense that if Apple does the pricing, because they really have to think about their company and the interest, and not only that, about the research and development for their facility, and coming up with new models, and that's the reason why I think the prices are really high, or the prices does really goes up from model to model.
Yeah, they want to make money, right? Profit incentive. And so when I rebutted you, I rebutted a reason that you never ended up giving anyways. I rebutted something about like accessories and like the cords also costing things. And you just picked a different reason. You just picked profit incentive, like Apple's going to set the prices in a way that makes them expensive, right? So when I try and pre-butted one of your reasons, it's really easy for you to pick a different reason. Like another example. I think that Raihan didn't apply to Harvard because it's really far away from home, right? And then it's really easy for you to come up with a different reason why you didn't apply to Harvard, right? Maybe it's really expensive. Maybe they didn't have the program you wanted to apply for. Maybe you have responsibilities that you can't leave around your home, right? There's a million reasons. Maybe you're afraid of Corona, right? There's a million reasons why you might argue that differently. And so it's not effective for me when I'm pre-butting from OG to try and guess what reason you're going to use. Instead, I should focus on what the impact is, right? And the impact is on what school you ended up choosing, or the impact is that phones prices continue to increase, right? And then I have to create a case that shows the exact opposite, right? And then I'm engaging with you on the impacts versus the reasons. Because especially if I say a reason and rebut it, you're just not going to use that reason. You're just going to use a different reason, right? And so you just want to focus on proving the opposite of what they say. If they're like, capitalism will cause good economic growth, you want to say, no, opposite is true. Capitalism will cause bad economic growth. That's our reason, right? Does that make more sense?
Yes, and thank you very much for answering the questions. It was really helpful and really explanatory.